Hello, everybody. This is Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association. So we have our guests, Katie Fallow, who is Deputy Litigation Director at the Knight First Amendment Institute, where she focuses on threats to free speech and a free press in the digital age. Ben Freeman is the Director of the Democratizing Foreign Policy program at the Quincy Institute, and has done extensive research on foreign influence in US politics. And he's written some interesting papers showing how much of it there is. And it's a subject that I started on and never finished a book on the lobbies 20 odd years ago. And since then, it's got far worse because we have the two aspects. The question is, will foreigners spend money to influence the US government? Yes. To what extent does the complete open financing of candidates assist this process? Tremendously. I mean, basically anyone with a checkbook can buy American foreign policy. Not least because for most American politicians, foreign policy is a subsidiary issue. They're not that concerned. I remember I interviewed Senator Fulbright not long after his retirement. And I said, well, they often say that you were fired because you had asked the wrong questions about Israel. And he said, well, it wasn't that so much. Just all they had to do was to tell the great folks of Arkansas that I was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. And they wanted to know what I was doing on foreign relations instead of concentrating on rolling the pork barrels home. So that was all it took, he said. He was quite sanguine about it. Obviously, asking questions about the Israel lobby was not conducive to congressional longevity. So it's it was not a foregone conclusion, but he certainly was not going to last a lot, get an extra term out of it all. So we'll be answering questions, and we're looking at the complexities of this issue. How, in a value-laden world, if somebody says Putin has a case about Ukraine, is that somebody being treacherous because they're bought, or because they genuinely think that the complexities of the geopolitics of the region after the falling of the wall made this a reasonable question? And it's quite obvious that there is money coming in. It's quite obvious where it's coming from and where it's going to. But then you have to decide, how can you litigate against that when it doesn't litigate against, perfectly reasonable? If East Timor, for example, wants to hire a lobbyist to say the Indonesians shouldn't come and take them over, is that bad? Or is it a normal means of influencing? So these are imponderable questions, and how to deal with them is another question entirely. And I'm leaving that to our guests. So, Kate, do you want to come in first on the sort of free speech issues here?
Yeah, and thanks for inviting me. I think, first of all, we're talking in the context of these recent indictments that were announced last week against two Russian nationals who were charged with violating the statute in question that Ben and I are going to talk about in particular, which is the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is a law that was passed in the late 1930s as a way to counter Nazi propaganda. And in this recent case, the DOJ is charging these two Russian nationals who were present in the United States with paying $10 million and using fake aliases and deceptive practices to, in the Department of Justice's allegations, conspire to get this company called, which subsequent reporting has shown to be this company called Tenant, to act as foreign agents without registering. So the indictment is against these foreign nationals, and this company Tenant basically hired a bunch of commentators, some of which are very prominent on social media, right-wing commentators. And it seems the commentators are saying they were unaware of this. But it all brings up this issue of FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is used in many ways against lobbyists, but has at times been used to require registration or be used for an allegation of failure to register, which is a criminal act, against even media organizations. And I think the free speech question is, which you sort of alluded to, which it is, under the very broad terms of the act could require registration of any media company or newspaper or journalistic enterprise, in addition to other entities that are in any way, under the direction, control, or ownership of a foreign principal. And the term principal could refer to a government or a political party, but it also could have referred to a foreign individual or a foreign a company. So in essence, under FARA, you could almost require any company that has a foreign ownership to register. But it's usually only been held to apply to things like RT, or a couple of Chinese, state-funded news organizations. And then there have been some calls in more recent times to require registration, for example, of Al Jazeera or one of Al Jazeera's components. So, my view from a free speech perspective is that FARA itself, this registration requirement, which is, just to be clear, it's a registration requirement. It doesn't restrict speech. You can still speak even if you're an agent of, a foreign agent. But it would impose some burdens, particularly on, journalistic enterprises. And so the question is, on one hand, from a free speech perspective, is it a good thing to provide transparency and information to the consumers of speech that this is being funded by a foreign state that might have hostile interests? To some extent, yes. On the other hand, it really could create a big chilling effect and burdens on news reporters. So I think that's a major problem.
Ben, what?
Yeah, and thanks for having me, and thanks to the Foreign Press Association, and thank you, Katie, for those remarks. I would just say I think we're going to be in violent agreement here. When we come at it from two very different angles, I'm a think tanker who I spend most of my days looking at these FARA filings, looking at indictments, trying to analyze it from a social scientific point of view. And when we look at this recent case and a lot of these recent cases, I think it's very clear that we want the U.S. government to be fighting to prevent any nation, whether it's a friend or a foe. And I want to come back to that point later. I don't think we should be distinguishing between, whether it's Russia, Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, whoever it is. If they're illegally meddling in the U.S., then I think we should try and stop that. And I think it behooves the Department of Justice and others to stop those covert influence campaigns. What we really want is we want America's interest to be driving foreign policy, not foreign influence. But the U.S. government, there's a line we've got to toe here. The U.S. government has to ensure that those efforts to combat those illicit influence operations, that they're not infringing on Americans' First Amendment rights. It's a difficult balancing act. I get it. There's no question about it. But it's crucial that our efforts to protect democracy don't end up undermining it in the first place. And in this recent case, if we respond to a Russian attack on our democracy by infringing upon free speech, something that's the heart of democracy, the Russians win, even if their campaign isn't successful. And, we need to make sure we're playing, we don't want to be playing checkers while the Russians are playing chess. If we have an illicit influence operation, it doesn't have to succeed on its own if we overreact to it. If we start to use influence operations as a pretext to stifle dissenting voices, to shut down political debates, the influence operations win, even if they don't do that specific thing that they set out to do in the first place. If foreign actors are looking to subvert American democracy, the very worst thing we can do is overreact and help them do it. And my fear is, I think very much to Katie's point, that there is a lot of fear out there now, about FARA, and, whether there's a lot of folks from the journalistic community, the think tank community and elsewhere, or where folks really aren't sure if they should register under FARA, when they should register under FARA, because, as Katie said, it is a very, very broad statute. And so, because of that broadness, it can encompass a lot of different types of activities. I do say my one sort of my consolation prize on it is there's a very different set of facts between what the FARA statute says and how the act is enforced. And the way DOJ has been enforcing FARA, fortunately, they have not been enforcing FARA to the broadness that it could possibly be enforced. DOJ has, even in the recent uptick in FARA prosecutions, DOJ has appeared to play, almost triage, focusing very heavily on foreign governments as those foreign principals, and particularly intelligence services. That we saw this in the Freeman Terry case with South Korea, foreign intelligence service. Focusing on that, and very much focusing on giving priority, at least, to money changing hands. And that's why I think you saw with this indictment, may not have had, a major influence effect, but the fact that $10 million, or almost $10 million, was changing hands, I think is one of the reasons why this particular case ended up on the DOJ's radar. I say all of this to alleviate some of the fears of FARA. I know there's plenty out there. We can certainly get into some of the other issues that are going on with FARA as well, but I'll leave it at that for my opening remarks.
Yeah, you introduced some of the complexities there, because, when is a foreign agent a foreign agent? I mean, when the Nazis were bidding for influence in the American media, they didn't have to send checks from Berlin. They had the Deutsche Amerikanische Bund having mass rallies in Madison Square Gardens with thousands of Sieg-heiling German Americans. In the case of AIPAC, they don't have to bring in shekels from Israel. They have local supporters all over the country prepared to carry their water for them. Similarly, like you, I went into the foreign policy lobbies, and it was a bit breathtaking that you found that the Greek and the Turkish lobbies were joining together to boost arms deliveries to both of them at the time when our official policy was trying to mitigate tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we were sending surplus arms for free to both Turkey and to Greece. And interestingly, of course, the Armenian lobby came winging in there because they were against the Turks, amazingly enough, and were prepared to lend a hand. So, you have this difficulty between indigenous support. It's quite legitimate that citizens of Americans of Polish or Ukrainian origin would have a view they want to express and see expressed. So, it makes it once again more difficult to draw the line. Yes, you can get a check coming from Moscow, but if the money comes in by other means, it's very difficult. Are you signaling, Kate? Do you have a...
Oh, I was just rubbing my face, but yes, no, I mean, I was gonna just follow up on that, if I may, that, I think it's a good point, Ben, that in terms of that the DOJ hasn't been, as aggressive in terms of bringing FARA criminal claims, and it's generally has been in situations where money has changed hands. On the other hand, if you see, there's this recent case, in fact, a jury just yesterday convicted 4 members of a social activist group in Florida, members of the American, I think, People's Uhuru Movement. It's a Black activists and white allies organization that's been around for 50 years, and they have very far left views. And in that case, a jury just convicted them of conspiracy to violate FARA, but actually the jury acquitted them of actually acting as foreign agents. And in that case, the argument was that the organization had accepted, I think, like $7,000 from a person in Russia, and this same person had encouraged them to have said that he was a member of an anti-globalist organization in Russia and had encouraged them to spread their words about anti-genocide and those kinds of issues. It turns out he was a Russian, agent. But the organization is saying these are free speech rights. We're being now sent to, facing up to 5 years in prison for espousing views that we've been espousing for 50 years, that they happen to line up with what this, guy was pretending to be, sort of just a member of an organization. And, this is what kind of echoes, and I know, Ben has talked about this case too, but that FAR has been around so long that it was used to indict W.E.B. Du Bois in the 1950s when he was involved in an international peace committee, and he was accused of violating FAR and tried, but the judge ultimately dismissed the charges. But on the theory that actually it wasn't, even though he was aligned with a lot of Russian views at the time, it was the argument that he had gotten some of his materials that he was distributing in the US from a committee in France. So, I think the main concern about this law is how broad it is, that because it could be used to kind of against this pretty small potatoes. I mean, I don't want to insult their work, but, in terms of their effect, a relatively small organization in Florida who are just social activists who happen to be, expressing their views. I mean, that's to criminally, charge them and put them in prison for engaging that kind of speech is sort of more something I would be used to hearing from the early 1900s or, in the kind of during the McCarthy era than currently. And the problem is that FARA allows the government to do it because the tool really could be used against almost anyone who's the language says if you're engaged in an action that is designed to either change government policy, and Ben, you can correct me if I'm misquoting, or just affect public opinion in the United States. And really any kind of news reporting, social media video would fall under just that big term.
I think one of the key points there is the venue. You mentioned Florida. Now, in Florida, the chances of a sort of black power group getting a fair trial is along with that of the Palestinian groups, the charities that were rolled up, the Holy Land cases, where obviously there's a lynch mob mentality from people that anyone who said that Palestinians had rights until a few years ago was obviously a witch and should be burnt at the stake. Similarly with black power, we saw that prevalent across the country. And you can hear it articulated by the former President Donald Trump all of the time. He uses these terms as swear words to invoke the lynch mob. So please carry on, Ben.
Yeah, I have to start with a confession. I'm coming to you all live from the great state of Florida. I live and I work remotely from the state of Florida, despite my DC, speaking of fake news, my fake DC persona. I do live and work in Florida, and maybe I can speak to this case a little, bit from that angle. And I think, Ian, to your point, it is surprising to have an organization like that, an activist like that in the state of Florida, which is become increasingly more red. Katie, as you were mentioning that case, it was bringing to mind to me also the Greg Craig case with it's a famous case with Skadden Arps too, where Craig was working for this firm, and at least according to him, his sort of counter allegations to it was that his case was political, and that there had been this real focus in DOJ and FARA enforcement on conservative actors, Manafort and others, Michael Flynn, and that his and others assumption there was that he was tried because they needed to go after somebody on the left. And, folks have said that too about the case you're talking about in Florida as well. And I think there, maybe there is some argument to that. I don't have confirmation of it. But it does go to your point, Katie and Ian, of how you can politicize the statute. because the language is so broad, and because frankly, DOJ, for all its warts, DOJ hasn't really done a good job of clarifying some of this. FARA has what are called advisory opinions, where you can submit, if you're concerned about whether you need to register under FARA, you can request an advisory opinion. You present your information to DOJ. DOJ provides a response to you, and then later on they publicly post that advisory opinion. But they redact a lot of information, and they make it very clear advisory opinions are in no way meant to be a precedent. And if you start to read through these advisory opinions, some of them start to contradict each other, and even dedicated FARA lawyers can't quite make sense of this advisory opinion versus that one, and so they don't end up actually being meaningful guidance. What we really need from DOJ right now, we need very clear guidelines on who has to register and when, and where the red lines are. And what we really need from Congress, we need FARA reform. I think it's clear to everybody, whether you're somebody like me who's looking at these FARA filings. I want more detailed information in many cases, but that's not clear in the FARA filings either. I would love to have more clearer language. I think there's First Amendment concerns we could address with the language of the act. Congress hasn't, FARA was last updated in 2007, wasn't really meaningfully changed since the early 90s. And so, you're talking about a law that started before World War II, and then was last updated before we really had the internet. So unsurprisingly, FARA is just, woefully inadequate at capturing the foreign influence landscape in 2024.
Keith?
Oh, well, a couple of things. One, I would just see that we have two questions, that one for each of us. So I don't really want to answer that now, but I also had a question for Ben. So I don't know if I should, maybe I'll start. Okay, I'll start with that.
Go.
Well, because one thing is, and I talked about this when we first started, but I really do think that there are some arguments that FARA does add positive things to the marketplace of ideas, because it is transparency requirement in many ways for things like lobbying and trying to uncover, or just at least bring into the light the kinds of using money to affect, foreign states using money to affect public policy or our government. And so we've talked a lot about the risks of it, but I'd like to hear from Ben the kinds of things that you think FARA provides that's beneficial.
Yeah, I think it is that it's that transparency there, and I think that it was two things. First, I think FARA right now, the foreign agent label, it's a scarlet letter. There's no two ways about it. If you get registered, people adamantly want to avoid registering under FARA because they don't want that label. And Katie, you were spot on about the paperwork requirements. It's not trivial. If you're registered under FARA, you have to report every single political activity that you engage in. You email a congressional office, email a member of the press. You text your buddy at a university about one of your clients. Any of those things have to be reported as line items in your FARA filings. The date, who you talked to, what the general topic of it was. It ends up being a lot. Some of these FARA filings that we review, they're over 1,000 pages long, and so it is a lot of paperwork. That said, what that provides to the American public is a level of transparency. And the way the FARA statute describes it is you want to provide a meaningful level of transparency to allow the public to meaningfully evaluate the work you're doing on behalf of your foreign clients. FARA doesn't prohibit anything. It doesn't, stop anybody from, emailing a member of Congress, talking to the press, or it doesn't prevent them from working on behalf of anybody. So what the statute provides is a sense of transparency. Now that sort of happens in theory. The way, literally, how I've made a career is by wading through the sludge that is the FARA website, and going to DOJ and pulling out these filings, because your average member of the public, FARA is just inaccessible largely. Combing through 1,000-page document to see, on page 453, they contacted your particular member of Congress. Very few people in the public are going to do that. So what I try to do is gather all that information. We try to analyze it, and we try to provide sort of holistic pictures to the public, producing reports. Ian mentioned articles and that sort of thing, just to provide folks with a sense of, what these, legal foreign influence and foreign lobbying campaigns look like, who they're contacting, who the players are, and what they're trying to get out of it. I think that's a valuable a service. I think that's actually helpful to democracy to see, how these foreign actors are weighing in. And I think for most of the firms that I analyze, I talk to some of these folks too. The requirements are burdensome, yes, but it's not stopping their work at all. They're still, the legal foreign influence industry is over $500 million a year. They're making a lot of money doing this, and they're registering under FARA. It's not stopping them from getting other clients. And so I think, FARA can work. If everybody who should register does, transparent about it, I think the public gets something out of it, and it doesn't stop these firms from doing what they're doing.
But you were mentioning before, I mean, there's a push and pull version on this. The fact that there's foreign money floating in to influence people doesn't address the problem of the people who are happy to be influenced. I mean, if you look at the campaigns mounted against the AOC and the Quad, for example, by AIPAC and their friends, it doesn't seem to help at all. If they go to the public, perhaps in Detroit and a few other places, if you go to the public and say, hey, the Israelis are trying to buy this election, it might work there. But then it's probably word of mouth as much as any official registration going. But, the same applies in other places, where there are large Ukrainian populations or Turkish populations. How do you, under the current financing laws, if these people are clever enough to put it through a super PAC, then their influence disappears. It can register as often as they like, and then they send a check to a super PAC, and it's away. It's laundered completely.
Yeah, you'll find no disagreement from me. There are just so many loopholes for foreign influence to get into the U.S. political process that are legal and that are absolutely covert. Another one, in addition to super PAC or dark money funding, within FARA itself, a lot of the firms registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. These are lobbyists who make a lot of campaign contributions to a lot of different people. Millions of dollars every election cycle comes from FARA registered firms to members of Congress. All of that's perfectly legal. We find over the years, I found dozens and dozens of cases where a lobbyist working on behalf of a foreign government will make a campaign contribution to a member of Congress on the exact same day they meet with them on behalf of that foreign client. When I write that up and people read that, people sort of yell, get out the pitchforks and yell, bribery, bribery, bribery. But I always have to remind folks, it's perfectly legal. These are U.S. citizens, they're abiding by U.S. laws, as long as they're contributing within the campaign finance limits, that's all perfectly legal. But, at the very least, that's another loophole that foreign powers could use to get, to sort of buy influence. Another one that I write about a lot, too, is foreign government funding of think tanks. This is a huge issue. Think tanks don't have to disclose.
I work at a think tank out of this.
Yeah, I work at a think tank, so I'm happy to belittle my field. We are, we have wonderful, we're wonderful, objective, idealists, but we got to keep the lights on. At the end of the day, somebody's got to pay the bills. And increasingly, we're seeing more and more that's foreign governments who are paying the bills for a lot of think tanks. But think tanks don't have to disclose that foreign. They don't have to disclose any of their funding, like other nonprofits if they're a 501c3. So that's yet another venue where you can see this money coming in. sort of very under the table, but very legally at the same time.
Can we address the two specific questions that came up? Ben, can you tell us what kinds of propaganda RT executives were allegedly trying to push and how?
Yeah, this was a question we were talking to before we went live here, and this is such an interesting case because Russia, instead of relying on RT or some of these other government Sputnik and other government mouthpieces that they already have, they allegedly had this campaign to pay these social media influencers. And really, when you look at the indictment and, having, looked at some of these, I'll confess, I was not familiar with most of these influencers, but before the indictment, but, went and looked at their profiles afterwards. And, a lot of what they were doing, during the period of this indictment, was stuff they had already been doing before. And, some of it, you might call it, conspiracy theory, but, other folks might call it, just an alternative information source. And I think they've been accused of spreading misinformation, disinformation, that sort of stuff. I think a lot of those questions are in the eye of the beholder. But I think what you really see when you look at their profiles, it's certainly not a mainstream media view on issues. And allegedly the Russians were turning to them for because it was divisive, and with the intent of sowing discord in the U.S. But the interesting thing to me, you sort of look at this and, you see if, like, during the time period of when the money came in versus the time period before, do you see a big change in their behavior? And I didn't. So, it's this, as with all influence operations, it's really a question of, yes, this illegal activity happened, but what did it do? What was the net result here? Did this really change stuff? And I'll tell you, on the legal side of things, if you spend $10 million on a legal lobbying campaign, you can get a lot done in DC for $10 million. Whether it's that arms sale or a trade issue, you can get a lot done for $10 million. So I think it's important.
Political operatives are cheap as well as venials.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay, I can.
The question came in there about the social media.
Yeah. So the question is, do social media influencers have the same protections as traditional journalists? Generally, yes, in the sense of, if we're talking about First Amendment protections for speakers, if you're a social media influencer, you'd have the same level of protection against defamation lawsuits. You would have the same level of protection against government censorship of your speech. The one thing where it might differ is in the area of, like, the reporter's privilege, that all of the states to some degree might recognize a privilege against divulging or disclosing confidential sources based on state law, and that has generally been limited to journalists. But obviously, in the internet age, there has been litigation throughout the states about who qualifies as a journalist. And, there's a lot of debates about if you're an influencer or you're just an opinion producer, is that a journalist? It kind of depends. And there has been litigation, like including of Project Veritas, the organization that has exposed, brought in, like, secret filming of various left-wing or Democrat-leaning organizations. And Project Veritas has said it's a journalistic enterprise. And I can't remember what the status of all their various litigations are. But, I think in general, if you are producing information that's of public interest, it should be protected by the First Amendment, even if it's something you don't agree with.
That's the crucial bit. I mean, well, that's what we were saying earlier about the difficulty of using the crude and unreasoning letter of the law and the police forces to make judgments on this. For example, I could quite well accept that the United States was completely inept in its handling of Russia after the fall of the wall, and that they helped pave the way to the situation in Ukraine. But that doesn't make me support that their reaction to it is appropriate. any more than thinking that Saddam Hussein might have had a case against Kuwait about the oil, but that did not justify him going in and whacking it or poisoning people with gas. It's a whole issue of judgment, which is very difficult to bring into law because you're dealing with nuance. And George W. Bush famously announced that he didn't want any of that nuance in his speeches, and you can see why. How can we get some nuance into this debate? I mean, it's obvious there's money coming in here. It needs to be identified. For their own reasons, much of the US political system doesn't want transparency on other issues, on finance in general. So how can you reconcile their wish to avoid transparency across the board in terms of financing with the aim of getting transparency with foreign agents?
I'll take a shot. I think part of the reason why we focus on this issue a lot, we're seeing this real crisis of confidence in government. We were joking before the call about crisis of confidence in lawyers, journalists, and think tankers, but public policy experts. There was a poll in 2022 specifically about public policy experts, and we actually fared lower in public trust than either lawyers or journalists.
Wow.
And yeah. Race to the bottom, we're winning. But the reason, is very clear when respondents were asked about, well, why don't we trust these think tankers, these so-called policy experts? And they have the number one reason was a suspicion of there's funding behind them that they're not disclosing. That they have these conflicts of interest that they're not getting out there, and they're not making publicly known. And so that's why a lot of the work that I do is trying to increase that level of transparency. Whether it's at a think tank or whether it's in somebody's registered under FARA lobbying operation, just to let folks know that if you're, particularly for journalists, I'd highly encourage folks that if you're using a source at a think tank, do your due diligence as much as you can, and report if that organization is funded by somebody who might have a stake in that issue that they're commenting on. We found this repeatedly, related to the Ukraine war and in other issue areas where think tankers are commenting on issues that are of direct relevance to their funders, saying things that would benefit their funders, and it's just not being mentioned in the story. And to me, that's a big part of the story, is if you have a source who might have this bias, just put that in there, let the reader know about it. And I will, shameless plug, we are next month, we are releasing a publicly available think tank funding database that's going to have all of this information, foreign government funding, Pentagon contract, US government funding of all the big think tanks. So, check out the Quincy Institute website in early October, and we're trying to help journalists and others, be able to easily, see some of those conflicts of interest and increase that transparency.
Well, if you pick your think tanker properly, I mean, Henry Kissinger, the old rogue, died covered in accolades, and he'd never turned down a check from the Chinese, the Russians, or anybody else to produce an opinion. I mean, no, this was copywriting, not think tanking, and there's many more like him. Sorry, that's me being unpopular again.
Well, I would just add in that, right, it's clearly a long tradition, but I would just add in, and I think, Ben mentioned this earlier, is that I think there are ways to reform FARA that would hopefully still allow it to get the kind of information that Ben was referencing that is helpful and is sort of good at giving people information about the sources of the sources of expertise or the sources of opinion, but without ensnaring journalists, scholars, scientists who, very, very regularly go to conferences in other countries or are connected, or nonprofits also are connected with other organizations in other countries that could, under the current version of FARA, be required to register and be required to label all of their materials as produced by foreign agents. But instead, I think there are ways to narrow the statute or reform the statute so that it decreases the risk of being applied to those kinds of activities, which I don't think should be the ultimate goal of this statute, and which create, serious First Amendment concerns if they are subject to criminal penalties for failing to register.
I
Right.
don't. Sorry, you were saying?
Yeah, I just wanted to pile on to what Katie was saying there. I have far too many conversations with think tankers and other folks around DC who ask me just about basic visits to other countries, and having a meeting at an embassy even, and folks do things like that, and then they say to me, Ben, do I need to register under FARA now? And I'm like, man, if that's the space we're in, that we can't have conversations with embassy officials, or we can't make trips to foreign countries to do research, that's a bad spot to be in right now.
1930s Soviet KGB stuff.
Right. And but that's the reality. Think tankers and some of them at my own organization are concerned about their FARA registration obligations just for taking a research trip somewhere. And this is why, completely agree with Katie. We need FARA reform. At the very least, we need DOJ and the FARA unit to come out and say, hey, we're not going to prosecute you just for going on a research trip to, wherever, whether it's, Russia or any of these countries. If you want to go there and do legitimate scholastic work, you're good. You're safe. I would love for the DOJ to come out and just say that for folks.
Right. I think we're at the beginning of the entry to considering some solutions to it. I don't think we're there yet. I think we've shown not just how much fuzzy logic there is in this that needs exploration. And just thinking about it is something that would be a step forward for most people, instead of having reflexive binary responses. Oh, that lobby's bad. I don't agree with them. This lobby is nice. They're right, which is about the basic philosophy of many people. So we're winding up now. Thank you both very much. We've explored the issues, I think, fairly thoroughly. Should remind you that next Wednesday at the Fitzpatrick Hotel, the Foreign Press Association is having a meetup and get together, which coincides roughly with the beginning of the UN General Assembly, where lobbyists like Henry Kissinger were always in attendance, and there'll be lots more there as well. It'll be lobby ground zero of world lobbyists next week. So September meetup, Fitzpatrick Hotel, 57th Street. Very nice place as well. We've had several occasions there. We have one now. So thank you very much again, everybody. Please do join us for the FPA. We have other events coming up. We're hoping to have something about the so-called reform of the Security Council soon. We've got several potential speakers there. The veto and where it goes. And we are looking at other issues like this, where journalists are put on the front line. And I mean, this is a minefield for journalists, as Ben was just saying. Because whatever you do, even if you keep your nose clean, there's nothing to stop a politically motivated prosecutor in Florida or New York or Wisconsin coming after you with razors waving, because there's so much ambiguity. It's very difficult to say, oh, I did everything right, because nobody could do anything right. It's too much fuzziness in it. So thank you very much again, Ben and Katie, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Take care. Bye.